This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Well, thank you very much, Eckhart, and also Claudia and Peter for the invitation. And I'm not as frequent visitor here as I'd like to be, so it's another reason why it's a pleasure to be here. In March of 1907, Aby Warburg read Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism and responded enthusiastically. He called it magnificent, prachtvoll, in his journal, adding that we must have this man for Hamburg. To his wife Mary, he wrote that the essay was one of the most impressive texts he had read since the works of Thomas Carlyle and Hermann Osthoff. Warburg read The Protestant Ethic at an important moment, as he was painstakingly drafting his essay, Francesco Sassetti's Last Will and Testament, in isolation in Berlin. And he claimed the treatise gave him the courage of his own convictions. The overlap of their interests is clear. Both explore the emergence of a modern turn of values towards active involvement in the world, toward the rational exploitation of natural resources or trade opportunities for the accumulation of wealth. Both were tracing the development by which the otherworldly demands of religion turned toward an ethical interaction with the larger world. For Warburg at the time, this was a process of enlightened reconciliation, part of the civilizing process. For Weber, it was part of a more ambivalent development of Western modernity. Yet the incompatibility of the sociologist's bold thesis about the origins of capitalism and the art historian's interrogation of the afterlife of antiquity is equally clear. Warburg claimed to find important confirmation in Weber of his own exploration of the process by which Sassetti, and we see here Sassetti on the left, right next to Lorenzo de' Medici, process by which Sassetti, a merchant in the service of the Medici, balanced a deeply felt religiosity with the worldly concerns of Quattrocento Florence. But if the sociologist was also concerned with the way Christian values came to be harmonized with worldly life, his argument was very different. Weber claimed to trace the development of a methodical mode of living oriented towards the accumulation of wealth to Calvinist notions of predestination and vocation. His argument was, in fact, that the secular advances of modern capitalism did not find fertile soil in Catholic Renaissance Florence, something that, in fact, was posited by the sociologist Werner Sombart in his Modern Capitalism of 1902 and repeated in qualified form in several works thereafter. Bernd Röck and Charlotte Scholl-Glass have laid this out, and they've also noted the strong identificatory aspect of Warburg's reading of Weber. The art historian seems to have been most affected by the pathos of Weber's discussion of the Protestant ethic, the iron cage or Stahlhartes Gehäuse of duty, of selfless toil in a calling that had become detached from the deep values that once gave it meaning. In the Protestant ethic, Warburg found deeply affecting terms by which to understand his own discomfort with his Jewish and mercantile Hamburg environment, but in Weber's description of New World Protestantism. It was a deeply personal reading of Weber on the one hand. On the other, Warburg refuses to argue in the open with Weber about whether the origins of capitalism are to be found in Catholic Italy or in the Protestant New World. Warburg sent his Sassetti essay to Weber, and Röck has found Weber's polite reply. That seems to be the end of the Weber-Warburg dialogue. But a closer look shows two things. First, it shows some good grounds for Warburg's rejection of Weber's thesis, as well as reasons not to engage in open debate. And second, it reveals a longer afterlife of this exchange, both in and beyond Warburg and Weber's work. And if Warburg's complex response left him open to accusations that he was a careless reader of Weber, the sociologist's work shows his own inability to get to grips with the work of the art historian. Teasing out the complexities of this interchange allows important historiographical and epistemological concerns to come into focus around the complex issue of both spirit and capitalism in the early 20th century. When Weber wrote Warburg, It seems at first glance that the sociologist had understood the art historian quite well. Weber was fascinated by the simultaneous presence, in Sassetti's testament, of mutually exclusive sets of values and approaches to the world, the sacred and the secular, or Christian and world-denying on one hand, and the pagan or world-affirming on the other. Weber wrote that he found Warburg's account extremely convincing, and points to the way that the essay captured, quote, the wonderful luster that fell upon this Florentine bourgeoisie, that it was not like the Calvinist one, standing on firm ethical ground, that it could not play the Superman with good conscience. The consciousness of the inner conflict and doubt, the suffering under the sudden incursion of economic forces that demand a new style of life, but which they cannot achieve on this ground, end quote. And those are Weber's emphases. Weber understands Warburg's attention to contradiction. Yet he reads the Florentine situation backwards through the lens of his own conclusions about the Protestant ethic, seeing in the Renaissance merchant an incomplete historical state, more particularly an inability to achieve a, quote, new style of life, end quote. He sees a teleology tending towards capitalist modernity, but this teleology in fact contradicts what he described as a fateful coincidence of value rationality and means-end rationality, Wertrationalität and Zweckrationalität, that produced, by an historical accident, the modern economy. This reveals that there are methodological reasons for Warburg's reluctance to get to grips with Weber's thesis. For Weber was looking for a unified point of view, a consistent set of values that would characterize a strong worldview in the historical sense, one that would create a consistent style of life. Warburg, for his part, found no consistent styles of life in history or in art, but rather an agonistic negotiation between competing values and beliefs that could be reconciled but resisted identity. Weber saw such clashes as signs of an incomplete development. And while Warburg implied at times a similar sort of teleology, his mention of Übergang, he was more interested in these inconsistencies and ultimately came to see them as constants of human history. The difference was not merely one of temperamental or methodological inclination. At the time of the so-called Methodenstreiten in the human sciences, much more was at stake. Warburg's attention to contradiction, his refusal to focus on form alone, and his rejection of linear development and the neat periodization amounts to an implicit critique of prevailing art historical models of style. Models that might be summed up perhaps best in Wölflin's famous statement that you could find the spirit of the Gothic in the shoes worn at the time, as we see on the left, as much there as in the greatest cathedrals. And that's, of course, because shoes then were style and not fashion. This model represented a compelling convergence of idealism, formalism, and historicism that saw in visual form a more or less faithful image of an historically specific spirit or worldview. It was an unstable convergence, creating methodological conundrums and inviting both circular reasoning and cliché, but the model and its problems were at the center of Riegel's notion of the Kunstwollen, Wölflin's ambivalent attempt to define the visual root of form, and Panofsky's neo-Kantian exploration of symbolic form. All of these attempts involved the need to abstract a common denominator of visual style, the conviction that such a visual idiom expressed something essential about a culture, and the axiom that this common form alone was an adequate expression of the culture. The likes of Riegel, Wölflin, and Panofsky were attuned to the methodological problems of this view, but they were equally attached to this paradigm. And the specificity of Warburg's contribution lay in his rejection of it. He drew attention to stylistic discontinuities in word and image. He insisted on the complex textuality of the visual, and he resisted the attempts to characterize cultures as harmonious or unified. In his essay on Luther, for example, he wrote as follows of Raphael's frescoes for the Chigi Chapel. And as we heard yesterday, this was a passage that particularly interested Walter Benjamin. Quote, "The formal beauty of these figures and the exquisite taste with which the artist reconciles pagan and Christian belief must not be allowed to obscure the truth that even in Italy, at the time of the greatest artistic freedom and creativity, the antique was, as it were, revered in the form of a Janus-faced Herm, One face wore a demonic scowl, exacting superstitious awe. The other face was Olympian and serene, inviting aesthetic veneration. The serenity and balance of the human form in the High Renaissance cannot, in other words, be taken as evidence of a consistent anthropocentric humanist culture. Warburg took images to be symptoms rather than essences, and dealt with them as singular artifacts rather than examples of a type. In comparison with this, Weber's work looks rather different, for all its sophistication. Weber worked with abstractions that combined the characteristics of diverse phenomena, fully aware, at least in his methodological writings, that they never existed in pure form. He called these, of course, ideal types. He was also aware that the process of concept formation was rooted in the present and had no claim for absolute historical validity. Such concepts were abstractions that unified and harmonized, that neatly packaged the past into unproblematic entities that simply, as he knew, did not exist. Weber was attuned to the risks of his conceptual tools, the risk of hypostatization. But the concepts of style and the ideal type had their own energy that inevitably led them to be taken as historical reality. Indeed, the orthodox art historical approach based on the concept of style was taken as a model by the economists of the later historical school of political economy and the sociologists who emerged from it. Werner Sombart, in fact, refers to the work of Wölfflin in writing that the task of the economist was to identify the style of economic systems, as art historians had identified the spirit of the Gothic. And many others did as well, Max Scheler, Karl Mannheim, and you can find a lot of those kinds of comments. In any case, many of these people, especially coming out of economics and sociology, considered the work of Riegel, Sombart, and Weber as related attempts to determine historical worldviews. For all his circumspection, Weber was working within this problematic. Warburg was not. The argument Warburg read in 1907 was, certainly, an extraordinary one. Weber saw the emergence of modern capitalism in the West as the result of a particular convergence. In his terms, the path to modernity was opened by the fact that means-end rationality, so characteristic of the modern economy and domination of nature, could lay claim to Western culture only when it became value rational. The Calvinist belief in predestination and in the signs of worldly success as evidence of God's grace led to a religious drive behind an ascetic organization of life combined with a ruthless quest for financial gain. And the argument led to extraordinary conclusions. First, he asserted that capitalism had irrational religious roots. And second, that capitalism had become irrational once again. Once these two forms of rationality converged, leaving subjects locked into the need for a calling in the absence of other values, modern industrial society no longer needed the religious bases of its origin. The result was rationality and specialization, the ascetic drive for the accumulation of wealth without the belief in God's grace or any other values, what he called the iron cage of capitalism. With its extraordinary derivation of a specifically modern form of alienation, the argument spoke to Warburg. But in it we find traces of hermeneutic habits of thought that I have explored elsewhere as a result of romantic anti-capitalism. In other words, the positing of a unified spirit and culture in the past that was, in fact, a fantasy, a projection onto the past of precisely the qualities of life that were felt to be missing from an alienated present. Already in the first edition of the Protestant Ethic that we know Warburg read, we see the search for a unified spirit put in these terms. In pathetic tones, he echoes the Kulturkritik of his time that bemoaned the loss of unity. Goethe, he writes, quote, tried to teach us the basic ascetic motive of the bourgeois style of life, if it is indeed to be a style and not its lack, end quote. The Stillosigkeit, or lack of style, of contemporary life, its failure to develop a unified spirit and culture, was of course a commonplace of contemporary thought. Cut off from values, from spirit, life was no longer, says Weber, the expression of a style. In later editions, Weber shows more such tendencies. For one, he removes the skeptical quotation marks around the notion of the spirit of capitalism. And he inserts a long footnote, 4 pages long, on Leon Battista Alberti, who was the son of a businessman. Zombart had pointed to his simultaneous piety and practical economic attitude. Weber, however, insists that his religion must be merely formal, and that he must already be inwardly emancipated from the tradition of the church, end quote. The Renaissance figure as resolutely secular with a clear-cut attitude and style of life. It is as if Weber had forgot the lesson of Francesco Sassetti. But significant though they no doubt are, these methodological differences should not blind us to larger and more significant implications of the brief meeting of minds between Weber and Warburg. 2 points need to be made. First, that in his works on the Florentine bourgeoisie and on pagan antique prophecy and the Reformation, Warburg had wandered into a large debate about the origins of capitalism. And second, that he wanted no part in it. Studying the complex afterlife of antiquity in the Renaissance, Warburg was working from the same sources as, for example, Werner Sombart in his Modern Capitalism, also in Der Bourgeois, and other studies including writings on fashion. In his work on Dürer and Luther, Warburg was covering much of the same ground as Weber and also Ernst Troeltsch in his monumental work, The Social Teachings of the Christian Churches. And in his work on the complex interrelations of religion, economies, and culture, he was in the very same territory as Georg Simmel, whose philosophy of money appeared in 1900 and whose religion appeared in 1906. Warburg was surely aware that the common ground needed to be traversed very carefully, as debates about capitalism were, as is now clear, inseparable from debates about religion. And in the case of Sombart's notorious The Jews and Economic Life, part and parcel of the anti-Semitism of the time. Thus, another reason for Warburg's refusal to establish the sort of precise links between religious beliefs and economic ethos that are so obvious in the work of Weber. Yet Warburg's refusal to accept the terms of this debate came at a cost. His pagan antique prophecy in words and images in the age of Luther, for example, looks dated compared to other writings of the time on the Reformation. Luther is the hero of Warburg's account, remaining skeptical of Philip Melanchthon's engagement with astrology. Luther is cast as, quote, the leader of the struggle for historical objectivity, end quote. Yet seeing Luther as the pioneer of an enlightened Christianity is a very 19th century idea. It is a view espoused canonically by perhaps the most influential theologian of the late 19th century, Albrecht Ritschl, who codified the view of Luther's rejection of Rome as part of a German tradition of freedom of conscience. In Warburg's time, Luther came to be cast in a much less favorable light. Ernst Troeltsch's Reason and Revelation in Johann Gerhard and Melanchthon of 1891 was a first move in a new picture of Luther as a more ambiguous figure. And 20 years later, in the Social Teachings of the Christian Churches, he focused on Luther's compromise with the prevailing political powers. This was key not only to Weber's view of Protestantism, but also to a line of thought that followed. Ernst Bloch, a student of Troeltsch and Weber, developed this in his Thomas Müntzer as Theologian of the Revolution of 1921, as did Hugo Ball in his left-wing anti-Semitic critique of the German intelligentsia of 1919. And there's something else that separates Warburg before Kreuzlingen from the sociologists emerging from the historical school and the critical theorists who followed. The project of determining the origins and nature of modern capitalism was part and parcel of a critique of technological and economic progress, of enlightenment. The discourse represented by such figures as Ferdinand Tönnies, Simmel, Weber, and Troeltsch was called by Lukács, as I mentioned, romantic anti-capitalism, and it was structured by a narrative of decline from pre-capitalist communities united by common values to an alienated capitalist society. And to that we can also add a decline from proper styles to mere fashions. The potentially crude distinctions notwithstanding, such a standpoint was extraordinarily productive, especially in the subtle hands of Weber and Simmel. Weber's thesis is typical. Exploring the irrational origins of the modern economic system, it allows a view of contemporary capitalism that reveals the causes of the alienation it engenders. Here again, Warburg's thought of the time looks dated, often structured by simpler notions of enlightenment and myth. The will of Francesco Sassetti is analyzed by a simple dichotomy and reconciliation of inward-looking piety and a secular, active approach to the world inspired by the ancients. Warburg shifts the terms somewhat in the Luther essay, with the Protestant form of Christianity and its alliance with an independent and enlightened approach to the world privileged over backward belief in magic. Here too, Warburg's work looks like a holdover from the previous century. He seems to believe that capitalism, or rather capitalist modernity, represented an advanced, if always endangered, epistemological position, at least until the serpent ritual lecture. In a statement of 1900, he was writing to his brother Max, asking for funds. He says that, quote, "Capitalism is capable of intellectual achievement of a scope which would not be possible otherwise," end quote. In its context, this is an extraordinary statement, though we have a sense of why it might have proved difficult for him to follow through on this line of thought. Thus, despite the subtlety of his micro-historical studies, Warburg's terms remained ahistorical. It's the timeless, starry sky that served Warburg as a figure for the transcendental ambivalence of the image in human thought, showing the possibilities of enlightenment always haunted by the tendency to fall into magical or mythic thought. Quote, "The celestial globe," he said typically in a lecture of 1911, "the customary symbol of the heavenly vault, is a genuine product of Greek civilization, arising from the dual gift of the ancient Greeks, their talent for the immediacy of a concrete poetic imagination, and their power of mathematically abstract visualization," end quote. The gods the Greek found in the sky, however, as he writes in the Pagan Antique Prophecy essay, quote, "were beings of a sinister, ambivalent, and indeed contradictory powers. As star signs they expanded space, marking the way for the soul's flight through the universe. As constellations they were also idols, with whom, as befitted the childlike nature of man, the mere creature might aspire to mystic union through devotional practices," end quote. But for the two generations for whom capitalism came into focus as an object of study, one with its very own specific political, existential, and epistemological puzzles, the skies were rather crowded with figures of thought, with Denkfiguren. Such figures give a sense of the various possibilities of knowledge in the terrain entered by Warburg. For the early Lukács, there was no contradiction there. Quote, "Happy are those ages for which the starry sky is the map of all possible paths, ages whose paths are illuminated by the light of the stars. The world is wide, and yet it is like a home, for the fire that burns in the soul is of the same essential nature as the stars. The world and the self, the light and the fire, are sharply distinct, yet they never become permanent strangers to one another. Thus, each action of the soul becomes meaningful and rounded in this duality, complete in meaning, in sense, and complete for the senses," end quote. For Lukács, the mix of magic and calculation was an effective horizon for orientation, but not timeless. For all its irrationality, it was preferable to a world drained of magic by the limitless instrumental knowledge of a calculable world, specifically modern capitalism. The alternative was the knowledge of the lack of meaning. Now, this lack is what had to be faced in manly fashion, he said, by anyone who chooses science as a vocation. The title of Max Weber's famous speech to students at the University of Munich on 7 November 1918, 5 days after Warburg entered the Hamburg psychiatric clinic of Dr. Arnold Linau. But this lack of answers to the fundamental questions of life brought forth its own demons. Weber's metaphors are revealing. A world devoid of orientation was, Weber said, the fate of modern man in a world he describes as one in which different worldviews, all equal and equally false in their denial of meaninglessness, fought for the allegiance of human subjects like the heathen gods. Quote, "We live as did the ancients when their world was not yet disenchanted of its gods and demons. As Hellenic man at times sacrificed to Aphrodite and at other times to Apollo, so do we still nowadays. Only the bearing of man has been disenchanted and denuded of its mystical but inwardly genuine plasticity. Fate, and certainly not science, holds sway over these gods and their struggles. Many old gods ascend from their graves. They are disenchanted and hence take the form of impersonal forces. They strive to gain power over our lives, and again they resume their eternal struggle with one another," and so on. Now, this is not what's usually read into Weber's essay Science as a Vocation, which is all about, especially at the end, Entzauberung, disenchantment. But what I've done here is I've put together passages that complicate this, that stand in tension with the theory of rationalization that's expounded in the very same text. When, for his part, Ernst Bloch looked to the heavens in his Thomas Müntzer, he stayed closer to Warburg's than to Weber's interpretation. He saw the astrological tendency Warburg had noted as one that would undermine the positive energies of the Reformation. If what he termed pagan pride had played a role in the Peasants' Revolt, which he saw as a forerunner of the class struggle, Bloch saw the risks as well. At a fateful moment, quote, "Their gazes went upwards. They sought to read God's will in the stars," end quote. The revolution fell prey to what Bloch in the second edition called, and this is certainly after he had read the work of Warburg, the other side of the Renaissance. This was Bloch's political commentary on Weber's and Troeltsch's Luther, whose idolization of the state, he wrote, led, quote, "to a new religion, capitalism as religion, which inaugurated a veritable church of Satan," end quote. Capitalism as religion. This is the title of one of Walter Benjamin's most compelling and mysterious writings, one inspired by Bloch's phrase and never published. It was one framed as Benjamin's reading of Weber's Protestant ethic and Troeltsch's social teachings of the Christian churches. Benjamin seeks to turn the tables on Weber's famous thesis. Instead of seeing capitalism merely as religiously conditioned, he takes it to be a fundamentally religious phenomenon, a new religion in a godless world. In this, perhaps, he was simply following the metaphorics of Weber's Science as Vocation. In any case, capitalism creates simultaneously guilt and debt, both, as he points out, Schuld in German, and does so completely without dogma. It, quote, "serves essentially to allay the same anxieties, torments, and disturbances to which the so-called religions offer answers," end quote. Benjamin declines, though, to prove his point, writing instead that, quote, "we cannot draw closed the net in which we are caught. Later on, however, we shall be able to gain an overview of it," end quote. It's an interesting image of a hermeneutical paradox, the impossibility of achieving knowledge from within a context and the simultaneous impossibility of escaping one's own position as a place from which to know. In his Origins of German Tragic Drama 4 years later, Benjamin would develop this paradox more fully, interestingly using the Warburgian figure of the constellation. The book we know developed under the ambivalent star of Warburg, intellectually productive, but professionally a dead end. Many others, including several who are here today, have explored this elective affinity, so I'd like to limit myself to just a few comments. For one, Benjamin was no doubt impressed by the way Warburg managed to avoid the trap of the art historical notion of style. Benjamin, too, had little use for bland concepts that subsumed complex works and reduced them to a common denominator. Style, or the ideal type, wrote Benjamin, was a fallacy. Quote, "As far as historical types and epochs in particular are concerned, it can of course never be assumed that the subject matter in question might be grasped conceptually with the aid of ideas such as that of the Renaissance or the Baroque," end quote. Rejecting an epistemology of easy approximation to the world of phenomena, he preferred an epistemology of the extreme. Quote, "It is erroneous to understand the most general references which language makes as concepts, instead of recognizing them as ideas. It's absurd to attempt to explain the general as an average. The general is the idea. The empirical, on the other hand, can be all the more profoundly understood the more clearly it is seen as an extreme. The concept has its roots in the extreme, end quote. And he was working here, as we found out yesterday, rather dangerously with the ideas of Carl Schmitt. Like Warburg, Benjamin was interested in the way a work's relation to its period exploded the ideal type. Benjamin studies the work of this period as precisely not coalescing into harmony, rather one that was predicated on rupture, on the lack of coherence. It was a critique of the kind of thinking that served as the motor of the work of Voegelin, Riegel, Weber, and the early Lukács. And Benjamin worked out the possibilities of knowledge by considering man's relation to the heavens. Ideas are to things, he writes, as constellations are to stars. The conceptual space Benjamin opens up by this image of the stars is an extraordinarily complex one. He complicates Warburg's sense of the constellation as a sort of map, one that gives orientation, but whose images could assume an autonomous and threatening life of their own. For Benjamin, the stars, or things, have no meanings in themselves. Truth is to be found only in their configurations. But the constellation cannot tell us what the star is, just as the star has no power to determine its own position. It cannot see how we see it. The individual existence of the star is preserved. Yet the constellations are not simply there to grasp. They're too far away. They're empty without the stars, and they're too dependent on the knowing subject's own position. It's an image of knowledge in a world of fragments that cannot be reassembled into any easy form of meaning. It is perhaps the only epistemology under conditions that Weber called, perhaps ironically, the revival of the pagan gods' fight for human allegiances. Benjamin's image of the stars was not the only such epistemological figure current in the wake of the sociologist's account of the disenchantment of the world. In his essay Das Ornament der Masse of 1927, Siegfried Kracauer combines Weber's account of rationalization with the categories of art history in a new way. In the organic movement of the forms of the past, the ornaments of their dance, one could, he said, read the spirit of the age, the spiritual bonds of an organic community. One could do this in the present too. His example is the Tiller Girls. But such an exercise yielded another paradox, that the ornament had become autonomous, that it existed above the human subjects of which it was formed, that they no longer could see the ornament or understand their place within it. The search for spirit to be read in an unmediated way from form showed only the lack of spirit governing form in modernity. In this shared figure of the limits of knowledge, both Kracauer and Benjamin are, no doubt, playing with a formulation of Nietzsche from The Birth of Tragedy. It is only, quote, as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are eternally justified. While of course our consciousness of our own significance hardly differs from that which the soldiers painted on canvas have of the battle represented on it. Thus all our knowledge of art is basically quite illusory, end quote. And here on the left is Altdorfer's Alexanderschlacht. But Benjamin and Kracauer lacked Nietzsche's faith that led to the leap into the realm of the aesthetic. Warburg was aware that progress was always precarious. By the time of the serpent ritual lecture, he saw that it was endangered from within. His description could come straight from Weber's Science as Vocation, and its account of the disenchantment, the Entzauberung of the world. And indeed it might well have. Letters show that Warburg was again engaging with Weber's work while in Kreuzlingen. Quote, our own technological age has no need of the serpent in order to understand and control lightning. Lightning no longer terrifies the city dweller. Scientific explanation has disposed of mythical causation. Whether this liberation from the mythological world view is of general help in providing adequate answers to the enigmas of existence is quite another matter, end quote. Like Weber, he saw the risk that disenchantment could itself lead to the destruction of the distance he thought necessary to enlightenment. Quote, the culture of the machine age destroys what the natural sciences, born of myth, so arduously achieved. the space for devotion, which evolved in turn into the space required for reflection, into Denkraum, end quote. Like the constellations taken as gods, technology without Denkraum could become dangerously tangible, turning the transformative potential of science into the destructive forces once found in magic. Like Warburg in the Serpent Ritual essay, and like him also perhaps thinking about Max Weber, Benjamin saw a return to myth. I'm missing a slide. Never mind. Okay, in an essay of 1926 with the Warburgian title To the Planetarium, Benjamin describes something similar. And here are two pictures of the Hamburg Planetarium. Like Warburg in the Serpent Ritual essay, and like him also perhaps thinking about Max Weber, Benjamin saw a return to myth. Like Warburg's Melanchthon and Münster's peasants, he saw a return to the stars. Quote, "Nothing distinguishes the ancient from the modern man so much as the former's absorption in a cosmic experience scarcely known to later periods. But it is a dangerous error of modern man to regard this experience as unimportant and avoidable. It is not. Its hour strikes again and again, and then neither nations nor generations can escape it, as was made terribly clear by the last war, which was an attempt at new and unprecedented commingling with the cosmic powers." End quote. Typically, however, Benjamin was ambivalent. The collective intoxication of cosmic experience could only be enlightened in the overthrow of the capitalist organization of this dangerous knowledge, only redeemed by revolution. And here, again, another important difference from Warburg. The specter of such a revolution was, we know, more than Warburg could handle, tainted as it was at times by anti-capitalism, framed as anti-Semitism. But both the possibility of it and its failure were part of the complex moment of modernity that he, Weber, Benjamin, and others were trying over these decades to grasp. It's a fascinating configuration of scholars trying to determine the relationship of modernity to reason, deeply aware that the tools of reason were a net in which they stood but could not draw closed. Scholars struggling for an overview but thematizing its impossibility. The view skywards gave no such overview. There was no map there of all possible paths. What we can say, however, is that if, underneath this sky, Warburg accidentally wandered into the terrain of a debate about the emergence of capitalism and the nature of the knowledge possible under those conditions, he did, in fact, leave his mark there. Thank you.